Well, good evening. You're all very welcome to the first of our series of lectures in the University of Birmingham Trinity College Dublin Digital Research Partnership. My name is Angus Ward. I'm a member of the University of Birmingham side of this partnership. Just to tell you, by the way, so that you all know, the lectures today, the three lectures that we have will all be recorded. And we'll be giving the lecturers in each case the opportunity to come back and comment and update what it is they said if they wish in the future. A little bit of background on our partnership with Trinity College Dublin and University of Birmingham. It began in 2019. A group of us here who work predominantly on textual scholarship, textual editing in the University of Birmingham, and a group of scholars, Jennifer Edmond and Michelle Dorn in particular, in Trinity College Dublin, who work on digital humanities more generally, came together to discuss and to research questions of trust and authority in the digital age, which seemed to us to be something which was quite central, not just to the research that we carried out, but also, I think, as a central question of the early 21st century. We've had a series of meetings in different places. These, of course, were interrupted by the pandemic. We had planned conference and a series of lectures, and now a year later, we are finally getting around to this. We have invited three very distinguished speakers to address this topic from different disciplinary perspectives over the next 4 weeks. So there will be a further two in 2 weeks' time, and in 4 weeks' time, there'll be further 2 lectures. So this is the first, and we're very grateful to have Rob Sanderson from Yale University speak to us today. I'm going to draw to a halt now, and my colleague Rebecca Mitchell, also from the University of Birmingham, will present Rob's lecture.
Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Rob Sanderson, who has recently joined Yale from the Getty in Los Angeles. He's the Director for Cultural Heritage Metadata Projects at Yale in the Office of the Provost. Rob has played leadership roles in several key initiatives around linked data and cultural heritage, including editor and chair for standards such as IIIF, web annotations, and most recently Linked Art, which is an application profile focused on usability and ease of implementation for cultural heritage linked data. He is a semantic data and systems architect, previously an information science researcher and medieval historian. Thanks, Rob. We will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca and Angus, and indeed everyone. I see lots of familiar names in the attendees list, so you will probably know some of the things that I'm going to say. So a quick overview. For those who are less familiar with what linked open data is, I'll give a very brief introduction of exactly what you need to know and no more, and then look at the 3 primary questions that we have before us about trust and linked open data in the cultural heritage sector, which are: how do we trust what was said, which I'll divide into 3 topics of sustainability, diversity, and usability. How do we trust that it was said at all? And we'll look only briefly at this, but in particular, the distinction between digital signatures and web archiving. And trust what it means, which of course is back to my area of expertise, being ontologies, vocabularies, profiles, oh my. With the conclusion that trust is shared, and you'll know full well what the acronym is by the time we get to the end. But first, some disclaimers. I am in no way a sociologist, psychologist, or cryptographer. I do know a bit about linked data, but I do feel somewhat of a charlatan in talking about the psychological and sociological aspects. So this talk is really reflections on what I have observed in the community and in usage of data generally. And it's more in the context of information theory and practice rather than in sociology. By which I mean it's all probably quite wrong, or at the very least naive. So I would very much welcome questions throughout. I have the question and answer tab open, and comments and discussion at the end. So without further ado, linked open data, what do you need to know? The basics of linked open data is essentially just, it's the web, which we all know and love, but the web of data rather than HTML. So institutions publish data on the web, just like everyone publishes web pages. So those bits of data are at URLs under the institution's domain name. That becomes a bit important when it's about trust. The data uses shared standards, which we'll come back to at the end. And importantly, the data has references to other bits of data also published on the web. They could be published by the same institution, so from one data set referencing another, or published by other institutions. And then we end up with trust issues as well. So I will not be talking about RDF, inference, ontologies, OWL, anything like that. I may use the word graph, that just is the connections between the bits of data. So now you know everything there is to know essentially about linked open data. So who is involved? I think it's important for trust to think about who is doing the trusting, who is the trustor, who is the trustee. We'll start off more simply, and we'll fill out these gray actors by the end of the presentation with the researcher, so the user of the data, and the publisher, the institution making the data available. Here then is a pretty basic interaction model for linked open data. On the left, we have the publisher. They make the data available online. That data describes some real-world cultural object or activity. The consumer then has some information need, which I represent with this question mark thought. They then, via the network, retrieve the data and hopefully are able to use that information to answer their question, to fulfill their information need. So what do we mean by trust when it comes to data? I think we can split it up into three separate areas, three separate facets. So first of all, there's accuracy. Does the data correctly represent the state of the real world, rather than the digital world, for the things that it describes? And while there is, of course, always opinion and inaccuracies, the degree to which the data is accurate is reasonably objective. It's about one thing and another thing in the real world. So it's less about trust and interaction between people and the data, and more just about a quality of the data itself. Then there's certainty. So this is the belief of the publisher as to the extent of the accuracy of their data. So you'll see this with people using maybe or possibly or probably in data. And this is reasonably subjective. Right? It's the belief of the publisher about their own ability to publish accurate data for whatever reason. And then utility is the other end, where it is the belief of the researcher that the data is useful for fulfilling their current information need. So this is also quite subjective. It's a belief, and it's time and question specific. So it's about their current need rather than is the data useful generally. That's interesting, but it's not the point of utility. So the notion of utility also comes from economics, in which I am also absolutely not in any way an expert, but is useful for this, where utility is the desiredness of a particular good, or in this case service, rather than its value, which could be quantified. So that seems to fit in with this same pattern. So how do we add those into the diagram? So again, from the left, the institution has some degree of certainty about the accuracy of how well the data describes the object. Then the user, again, with respect to their current question, has some belief about the usefulness, the utility of the data to answer that particular question. And in this case, hopefully the question is about the object, otherwise it will certainly not be useful. So a couple of examples just to get us thinking about this. Here is an example from the art gallery here at Yale, which I think is possibly the most comprehensive example of uncertain or the varying degrees of certainty in cultural heritage data. So from least to most, the artist is completely unknown, but it was formally attributed to Charles Wilson Peel. So we know that it is not Charles Wilson Peel. It possibly depicts Mrs. James Gittings. It was made around 1790, but we're not sure. It was probably made in the United States, and it's definitely watercolor on ivory and plaited hair with a gold cipher on the verso side. Here's another example of, in this case, inaccurate data. So that previous one we found through looking for human remains in our data. So the hair was what found it. So in that case, it was actually useful. In this record, we found in a similar or related experiment, looking for people who were still alive, and thereby the oldest people, youngest people, and so on. So Blake Edwards, according to this record, born 1922, died in the year 39 trillion, which is somewhere about the time when the universe runs out of hydrogen, to give some sense of scale. And indeed, here is the picture of Mr. Edwards looking quite bemused, probably at his described death date. He actually died, unfortunately, in 2010. And the year 39 trillion is actually the barcode of the laserdisc, in completely the wrong place in the record. So here it's presented as certain information. It's entirely inaccurate, and for the purpose that we had, it was not very useful. Though it did mean that we could correct the record and move the barcode to the right place. Okay, so trust then, we haven't mentioned trust. So we can further split the relations into those of the actors to the data and actors to other actors. So here we can split trust into confidence and trust. So confidence then is the belief of the consumer in the current and past competence of the publisher. So how accurate is the data? That accuracy is not about anything which is going to come in the future. It's about things which the publisher has already done. So were they proficient in publishing data accurately? So here, this then is the flip side of certainty. How confident is the consumer in the data rather than how certain is the publisher in it. Trust then is the flip side of that. It's the belief of the consumer in the current and future benevolence of the publisher. So this was that the publisher will continue to make available accurate data. There's a further step, which is dependence, which is when one actor relies on another for the successful outcome of some function. We'll see that come up a few times, but it's not the focus of this. So then to add this relationship into the diagram, the consumer has past confidence in the past competence of the institution and trusts their future benevolence in continuing to publish accurate data. But do we really mean the certainty of the institution? Surely, if I were to walk down our ivy-covered halls and ask any of our ivy-covered professors, what do you think about the death date of Mr. Blake Edwards? Or was it really Mrs. James Gittings depicted? They would have absolutely no idea what I was talking about, let alone any degree of certainty about that relationship. Instead, of course, what we mean is the content specialists who worked on the data have some, and published it, have some certainty about that accuracy. But did they publish it? Well, there's other people involved, of course. There is the data and software specialists working with databases and other technical systems who actually do the publishing, whereas the content specialists are working with that database to create the information in the first place. So this link, still going to the institution, perhaps should be related somehow to these people, because it's their abilities that we should be confident in and trust. So should we be thinking about personal trust or institutional trust? So trust in the institution, of course, comes by and large from the reputation of the institution, including, but not exclusively, by considering confidence in their abilities over time. If they have been good in the past, it is likely that they will be continue to be good. The data, though, is created by the actions and expresses the beliefs of many individuals, hopefully, assuming that the data set continues and is maintained and updated over time. So now we come to the first trust paradox, which is that linked open data is relatively new. It's not that we have a long history of institutions for many decades publishing linked open data, and we can say this institution has done this well for 100 years, they will continue to do it well for 100 years. That's clearly impossible. But our trust in the institution will take into account factors that have absolutely nothing to do with linked open data and predate it. So should our trust really be in the people responsible for the linked open data rather than the institution? And this is the first topic I want to explore. So the benevolent action that I think we are trusting is that the institution will continue to make accurate data openly available. So in order for this to happen, I think sustainability is one of the key factors. The first aspect of that is that the data has to be a product and not a project. It's something that the institution will continue to invest in, both in terms of people and technology and the data itself, rather than something which is time-bound and can go away. Right? If we want the institution to continue to make the accurate data openly available, essentially in perpetuity, then this is something that this is a big ask. This is something that the institution needs to treat as a core product rather than something that they can ignore after 3 years of funding ends. In order to do that, the data must have both internal and external impact. E.g., it must be demonstrably useful to the organization. Otherwise, why is the organization investing in all of this time and effort? And it has to be demonstrably useful to others. Otherwise, why invest the time and effort in publishing it openly, which is not a zero cost? Further institutional longevity will likely play a part in our trust in the institution and thereby in its data. So an established organization is thus more likely to continue to exist and retain its focus and its ability to publish the data. We're also more likely to have heard of it rather than a startup or newcomer to the scene. Institutional resourcing, of course, is important. A well-funded organization is more likely to be able to continue to invest in the product when harder times come because they have more resources to throw around. And likely most important, there needs to be appropriate governance for the product. So especially in linked open data, there is a need to balance internal and external participation. It's much easier if you don't need to depend on others. However, to the last point, it's much more valuable to have a broader range of participation, to have more data available with further experts and expertise invested in it. A balancing of the recognition of the institution versus the individuals that have worked on it, balancing quantity versus quality, given a finite amount of resources. You can have lots of things, or you can have fewer excellent things, but you can't have all the excellent things. And balancing accuracy versus usability, which we'll get to in the next section, and ensuring the diversity of the work. So to talk further about diversity in terms of trust, people tend to view the actions of other members of groups with which they identify, which we call in-groups, more favorably than those of members of groups with which they do not. So I apologize for reading my slides, but this is an important one to get right. And the key factor is even when the action is identical. If the Getty published some linked open data about anything, I would be, because I would identify with the Getty as a group, having been employed there and being in the cultural heritage space, more than, say, Google, even though Google demonstrably has vastly more resources, vastly more people, vastly more technology experience. So if Google were to publish a description of the Mona Lisa, say, and Getty were to publish a description of the Mona Lisa, and they were the same, we would still be more likely to trust the Getty with which we identify, rather than Google, even though the data is identical. So we're more likely to trust organizations that seem to share similar missions, constituencies, or worldviews to our own. So we trust things that are similar to us. And this is in-group, out-group favoritism. But the paradox is cultural heritage is necessarily diverse because it spans all human activity. So in being able to understand cultural heritage surely requires systemic diversity. So we shouldn't be trusting those organizations that are most similar to us. We should be trusting organizations that are the most diverse because they have the most likelihood of understanding and being able to publish the descriptions of those objects, their heritage. And this applies at both the institutional and the individual level. By that, I mean that we need diverse institutions, not just centralized, single, well-funded, white institutions. So, for example, in Los Angeles, there's also the Autry Museum of the Southwest, a lovely museum dedicated to Native American arts and culture, but they are not well-funded. They're interested in linked open data, but it's hard for them to participate. And at the individual, we need to have curators and content specialists, folks engaged with the data from diverse backgrounds in order to fully understand and appreciate it. And I see Erin in the participants list. I have gratefully stolen her slide from a wonderful conference about a month ago for the Links project to try to explain the importance of this aspect. So structuring data is a political act with ethical implications. By this, I believe, Erin, means that information systems enact systems of power, because when we choose how to structure that data, we have made some choice. That choice comes from our background and our biases and our understandings of the models, the ontologies, the vocabularies, and so on and so forth. All of these existing structures, standards, and understanding have come from somewhere, and that somewhere is contextual and contingent upon the biases and level of engagement of the different individuals and institutions in that work. So the ethical implications then of choosing how to structure something, not just to publish it or whether it's correct or not, are critical, and we need to engage with this. So thus, I finally, you might be thinking, come to my title, Illusions of Grandeur. So the aspects of trust that we've talked about are similarity with ourselves, the external impact of the institution and its work, the longevity and resourcing of the institution, right? The reputation of the institution by which we trust it. However, more related to the data are the governance of the product, the internal impact, which enables it to be used and sustained, the diversity of the people and institutions that went into its creation and maintenance, and the people directly responsible for its creation and maintenance. And these are by and large invisible. So here is my thesis, that we base our usage of linked open data on the illusory grandeur of the organization. And that has pretty much nothing to do with the data itself. But don't worry, we can add in some more actors and it gets worse. So the next person or people, the next role is the client software engineer. Because, hi Matt, unless you are Matt Lincoln, you don't, or some other digital humanities expert, you don't interact directly with the data, you see it via some application that's been built by a developer and it projects it onto the screen. That developer, who could come from a completely separate organization from the data, relies on the data being usable. So this utility is how good is the data for solving this question. The usability of the data is how easy is it for the developer to use the data for their task of building an application for the researcher to use. And just as an intuition point, check your thinking about this versus this. Did you intuitively distrust this symbol because it had a dollars and intuitively trust this because it's got an academic hat? That's in-group similarity. Okay, usability. So the data has to be usable by a software engineer in order to build the interface to then be presented to the researcher. So the user of the data isn't the researcher, it's the application developer. The researcher experiences the data only through the lens and thereby the biases of the developer's application. But doesn't that mean that the utility, which is the belief about the data of the researcher, is not actually in the data, it's in the presentation of it? So the perceived utility of the data then directly depends on the usability of the data. Just like the researcher is dependent on the client developer, their belief about the utility is dependent upon the belief of the client developer about its usability. So here, for example, is an application developed at the Getty, built on linked open data, that presents archives. Attractive, seems reasonable, probably trust it. And here's the data on which it is built. So it's in linked open data, it's even in linked art. It uses both internal and, custom and internal, but authorized vocabulary. It's in JSON and so on. So this structure has been designed to be usable in order to build user interfaces like this in order to allow the researcher to do useful, interesting research upon that information. So if the utility depends on the usability, then surely that utility also contributes to the external impact. Right? The external impact of the application and data is the aggregate perceived utility of the users. But as we've said, the external impact is a factor in trust. So now our trust depends to some degree on the utility of the data, which depends on its usability. So really, we should be considering how usable is our data, and given that usability, how accurate can we make it without reducing this to the point that the utility goes down and the trust goes down. So there is, in the IIIF realm and linked art, there are 10 design patterns that we've identified as being particularly useful for usability. I'll go through them briefly. The first is to scope design through shared use cases. If there aren't use cases in the community, then it's unlikely that you need it. Design for international use, because if you're limiting your audience to only one language, then or one geographic region, you are thereby limiting your external impact significantly. Make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. And this is directly to the experience of the developer of the data. Make it easy to use. So make the easy things easy, but to accuracy, make the complex things possible. Avoid dependency on specific technologies to make it easier to migrate. So the data and software specialists make it easier on them as well. Don't break the web. So don't do things which would not work with the rest of the web. Separate concerns, design for JSON-LD. So JSON-LD is the JSON form of linked data. And then down at 9, follow existing standards and best practices, and 10, define success rather than failure. So again, this is the IIIF design patterns, which are based around this notion of usability. So the next question, how do we trust that it was said rather than how do we trust the data? How do we know the data is useful? So we've got this big cloud, black box in the middle of the diagram. Essentially, it seems like everyone needs to trust the network for this diagram to even begin to work. So what do we mean by this trust? As Adam Soroka of the Smithsonian said at one of the Linked Art meetings, don't fear the network. This is one of Linked Art's design principles. And from cybersecurity, there is an interesting acronym, CIA, the cybersecurity triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, we don't really care about confidentiality because the data is open, right? We don't need to limit who can access it. So that one we can ignore. But both availability and integrity are important. So data availability is essentially, we trust that the data will be delivered successfully in an appropriate time, in a timely fashion, when it is requested. So the trust then is that the institution will continue to make it available and the network will continue to transfer it. I think we've talked about availability already. So the interesting one is integrity. How do we trust that the data will not be modified en route? So it leaves essentially the publisher, it gets to the consumer. How do we know that what left is what arrived at the other end? And again, we have these baseline assumptions of it being delivered from the institution's own domain, whereby we know that this institution is responsible for it, and it's delivered via HTTPS, so that we do not need to worry about privacy concerns. And okay, so I see people, or would see people smiling and essentially raising their hands saying, I know, we should use a blockchain. Or I can make that diagram simpler. Do I need a blockchain for this? No. But if you happen to have a spare $69.3 million, I do have a bunch of linked metadata about images that I would be happy to sell you. So there is, however, one actually important aspect of blockchain for this purpose, which is that blockchains are built on signatures, digital signatures of the data. So digital signature is the mathematical proof that the data has not changed, even when it is both the signature and the data are transferred over an untrusted communication channel. It does this via public and private keys, which we don't need to worry about. But essentially, the takeaway is it is a small, relatively string where any change to the data will change that signature of it. So you can validate the data against the signature to know that it hasn't changed. This becomes trickier in the linked open data space because the data is a graph with blank nodes that don't have identity. In fact, it's a particularly challenging mathematical problem to do for a graph. There has been a lot of research done, and linked data signatures are coming in the W3C. If you happen to be at a W3C member institution, do have your AC rep vote for the linked data signatures charter. But thankfully, they're also unnecessary for our use cases because the data is open. We don't need to ensure that it has not changed en route directly, because it's just as easy to archive it with web archiving. So here we can use a trusted third party, which doesn't work with blockchains. That's one of the do I need a blockchain tests, to ensure both integrity and the availability of the data. So you can validate that the data that you received is the same as the data in the archive. Ta-da, you know that it's what was said. Say that you tried to retrieve it from the institution and you can't, well, there it is in the archive. So now we've solved both integrity and availability with one process. So the other benefit, of course, is that cultural heritage organizations are often already engaged with web archiving for digital preservation purposes. So it's not that this is a new technology or a new sector to have to deal with. It also allows us to essentially time travel through different versions by rolling back the time in the archive to see those previous versions. We can then do queries in the past to see what the data would have said. For example, the artist who was previously attributed Peel. At some point, clearly, we did attribute that object to Peel. We no longer do. In the past, the data would have said Peel. This can work across multiple archives, including personal ones, via Memento, which is also known as RFC 7089. But for this to be useful, we need to know that all of the data is archived and available. In order to do that, we need to know two things. First, what data exists? Where are all of these linked open data records? And when does it change? E.g., when do we need to re-archive it? There are various solutions in this space. OAI-PMH is pretty easy to implement, but aging, it's now some 22 years old, could have a PhD. Resource Sync is newer, built on Google's sitemaps, less well implemented. And activity streams, which is a W3C specification, and then customized for this purpose in the IIIF community as the IIIF Change Discovery API, which has the URI there at the bottom. And this is about to hit 1.0. It's been through 2 betas, and we have all the implementations needed to pull the trigger on it. So we are hopeful that this will be official IIIF specification in the next month or 2. Here's another advantage, to go back to trust. We can separate our notions of confidence and trust by adding the archive. So if we don't trust that the institution who's publishing the data will continue to make it available, but we do trust that they published accurate data, currently or in the past, then by having this archived copy available at a third party, we can separate that trust of future availability to our belief in the benevolence of this institution. Say it's the Internet Archive or a national library or some other more data and archive specific organization. So that gives us an advantage and opens the door to more institutions playing this role, I believe. Okay, so how do we trust what the data means? Or how can the researcher be sure that their understanding of the information is what was intended by the content specialist? Essentially, if I have a question as a researcher, how do I know that there is any relationship at all between my worldview, my question, and the worldview, the understanding of the object of the content specialist over here? Because these two people, if they could just sit down with a whiteboard and the object, I'm sure it would be very easy to answer this question. However, they are at opposite ends of this network. Seems like a hard problem. We can reduce it though, because the data modeler, the last entry in our, almost, in our list of actors, at the institution can work directly with the content specialist. So the content specialist has the understanding of the real world, this is the art historian. The data modeler needs to have a reasonable understanding of that and be able to translate it into the data. The application developer needs to have a reasonable understanding of the data and be able to translate it into the application for the researcher to answer their question. So the application developer needs to understand the model in the same way that the data modeler does, but these two don't need to communicate directly. So how do we solve this question? Which is, of course, a shared standard. So if the data modeler uses a standard, the application developer from a different institution uses the same standard, then, assuming they've both applied it accurately, then any number of these can work with any number of these applications, so long as they've implemented this well. However, standards need the same considerations in terms of trust as data. So if the standard conveys the meaning and is sort of the central point for how all of this works, how do we trust the standards? So standards then need to be sustainable products. They need to have governance, which has all of those features of diversity and inclusion, and it needs to be published by ongoing, well-resourced institutions. They should be archived, different versions should be available, any machine accessible information, machine computable information should be harvestable, along with the representations for humans. They need to be usable by data modelers and developers as the people who are most directly affected by them. They need to provide utility to the content specialists and researchers who need to be able to communicate via, essentially via the work of the data modelers and developers. And critically, there needs to be this diversity of institutions and people in every role. Otherwise, we are looking at the centralization and homogenization of knowledge to the exclusion of those diverse communities who are not traditional participants in white, middle-aged, male developed standards. So standards, plural. There's a few standards and their interactions that's worth describing. Because of that diversity question, we can make it easier to participate when we understand how the standards environment, the standards ecosystem works and how it plays into the work of the rest of the larger ecosystem. So there are three tiers of abstraction standard. There's the conceptual model, which is just the abstract way of thinking about the world. And this is where we absolutely require diversity because it needs to be consistent and coherent, unlike, say, a crowdsourced, constantly changing conceptual model. It needs to be then encoded in an ontology, which is a set of terms that encodes the thinking about the concepts in a logical and, importantly, machine actionable way, so that we can then create new knowledge and structure graphs. And then there is the vocabulary. So these are a curated set of subdomain specific terms, such as art museum terms, as opposed to natural history museums or libraries or archives, which then make the ontology more concrete. So the distinction between a physical object generally and a painting. While an archive might have use of a painting, the notion of painting, it certainly needs the notion of a physical object. And then these are refined or specialized by implementation standards. So then there are two of those: a profile, which is a selection of the appropriate abstractions, so an appropriate model, appropriate ontologies, appropriate vocabularies that encode the scope of what should be able to be described when you use this profile. So it doesn't create new things unless it absolutely has to. It merely selects aspects from the previous layer. That is then made available by an API or application programming interface or agreement preceding interaction, which is a selection of appropriate technologies that give access to the data, which is managed using the profile, specializing these guys. So as an example, linked art, we use the CIDOC conceptual reference model. CIDOC is the International Museum Standards Organization. We use an RDFS encoding of CRM version 7.1 plus a few extensions. For vocabulary, we use DT-AAT and then some very minimal extensions for things that haven't made it into AAT. So the profile then, the scope is art museum oriented, but we sort of dip our toes in adjacent domains of libraries and archives, people, places, subjects, and so on. Because without those connection points, there's no way that we can be part of the wider web of data. In the API, we use JSON-LD, just like IIIF does, with 10 primary divisions of that content. So how do we connect it? Connect all of the dots, connect the Lego bricks via shared standards. So the application developer needs absolutely to understand the API because that's what their application is going to use to get access to the data. They need to understand the profile well enough that they can create an appropriate interface so that the user knows how to engage with data in this profile. Then the data modeler doesn't really need to know how the API works. That would be the software engineers who publish the API over top of the data. But they do definitely also need to know how the profile works so that they're not selecting ontology terms or vocabulary terms, which they need to know to describe the work that are not part of the profile. So then the question and the understanding of the object are part of the overall conceptual model of places and communication and digitization and books and people and so on. So this is where we need the diversity of domain theorists, ontologists, taxonomers, technical folk, systems folk, content specialists, researchers, modelers, everyone, as many people who can contribute to the understanding of the model makes this better, which makes this better. So we can trust then what was meant in this space because the model has diversity and rigor. The ontology and vocabulary then encode this. It is specialized by the profile for the use cases of this sort of subdomain. It's made available via a documented API so that this person can interact with the data easily. And because of these shared connections, the researcher can then ask the same question as the content specialist has the answer to without needing to talk directly through essentially this encoding. So now we have gone through pretty much all of what I mean by trust is shared. So trustable data and standards are sustainable, it's necessary for ongoing use with all of the features that we've talked about availability. Harvestable, again, it's this ease of access and the backup plan to allow confidence in the publishing institution and trust in the archive. It needs to be available online with clear usage licenses and so on. It needs to be reconciled. We haven't talked about reconciled, but this is the linking factor across systems. Enhanced, we should incorporate others' knowledge, not just our own, and especially diverse when it comes to institutions, people, and practices. So thank you very much for your attention. I do look forward to any comments, criticism, questions, or any other engagement, either now or there's my email address, there's my Twitter. If you want to look at the slides, they're on SlideShare. Do reach out or ask questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was absolutely fascinating. We do have one question in the Q&A, which came mid-talk, I think, and you might actually have addressed this. This is Matthew Lincoln, and I'm not sure if he's here or if Matt, if we're empowering people to speak or not. But basically, he's asking about the connection between the closeness of the data engineer and the client developer, which you did address. But could you say maybe more about that if you've seen it in practice or how well that might work?
Yeah, let me just go back to the slide. This is what I think is the usual slide. So indeed, if the client developer actually sat over here working directly with these, it's initially very beneficial, of course, because then you have the same close connection. The disadvantage is, which I think is where Matt was thinking, that when this becomes essentially groupthink, or otherwise the focus is on getting it done quickly and cheaply rather than correctly, then you can cut corners very easily when this person, and this person, or people are sitting in the same room and essentially colluding on the answer. However, that collusion, while valuable for this one piece of data, when it comes to then other people who aren't part of the in-group working with the data, it becomes much harder because we don't have this. So if there isn't a shared standard that's being built to, then this person essentially has no chance of working with this data. It's unusable to them because they don't have the frame of reference. They can't understand how to get from here to here to here to here. The other advantage of having the standard in the middle is you have many institutions publishing data and many applications built. If they all use the same standard in the middle, then you can swap them in and out. You can use the one application on a totally different data set than the one it was initially built for. And we've seen this really well in the IIIF space, where there are multiple, probably a dozen or more applications that can consume IIIF presentation and image API resources, and several dozen backend systems, all of which communicate via the shared standard, and you can intermix them and swap them in and out with relative ease. So yes, there's an initial advantage because you get to this more quickly, but a long-term disadvantage because you are limited in the number of applications and you're limited in interoperability.
Thanks. Jennifer, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks so much, Rob, for that incredibly clear and well organized talk. I think I will be looking for your image in order to unpack it and use it as a way of explaining this very complex ecosystem of researchers and technical developers and content specialists, because I think sometimes it's a bit difficult to grasp the complexity of that, of all the different actors who work together. But I did want to ask you, because I find your ideas around in-group and out-group quite interesting, but in some ways, I'm not sure if I agree, because when I think about, well, why do I not trust Google? It's not because my role is different from theirs or my institution is different from theirs. It's because I perceive their goals and their values as being different. And in fact, I would much sooner trust a library or an archive with data management than I would myself as a researcher, because I recognize that that's not what I'm built for, as it were. So in some ways, I'd like to just kind of ask you what you think about that idea of it not being so much about in-group and out-group, but what we perceive institutions as being for. And then maybe as a sort of a further follow-up of that, the question of, does that mean that in fact, if we're talking about linked open data, well, maybe we don't want to trust institutions, but maybe it means we don't want to trust institutions now, because maybe it's that we don't necessarily see them having the resources to hire in the developers to be at the technical cutting edge. But actually, I know that that's the set of players in the ecosystem that I want to be at that cutting edge in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, when we really need that value system of preservation and completeness and checking and authenticity and protection and all of those values that we look towards these institutions for. So I just, again, this is what was rattling around in my head as I was absorbing what you're saying. I was just wondering about your response to it.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, I agree. I think it's as I said, I'm absolutely not a psychologist or sociologist. So when Rebecca asked me to talk about trust and linked open data, my response, Rebecca can assure the accuracy of this statement, was, I'm happy to do that, but you should probably find someone who knows more about what they're talking than I do. However, I think there's a degree of the in-group favoritism because of the shared worldviews, as opposed to them being completely separate. But similar to diversity, it's not that we need a completely diverse set of folks looking at every single object and coming to a universal understanding of it. We need appropriate people with appropriate different backgrounds to work with the object or the culture, the heritage. And I think we need the same structure for the groups, the organizations, the people that are publishing the data. It's the similarity between the question and the ethics and mission, the worldview of the organization. How do we get from the question to the understanding of the people? The similarity is important through the, as communicated via appropriate standards, but if it was a commercial organization publishing data for commercial purposes, they would have a different worldview than one which a cultural or academic institution might have. And hence they would probably publish different data and we might trust them a different amount. So yeah, it's all entangled like a web. I've tried to pick out some of the threads, but it's absolutely a beginning of an understanding rather than anything more than that. Did that mostly non-answer? Was it somewhat satisfying?
It did. And I mean, I would just say, I guess, thinking kind of continuing to think along with you if to the best I can. You're bringing up the web archives. Obviously, we have a little bit of, there's some hesitance about using web archives for research sometimes because of things, specifically because of things like Memento, because of the sampling methods. But what you're presenting, I think that's really compelling, is that there's this ecosystem of actors and this ecosystem of roles, and that's what's evolving. And the Web Archives doesn't mean we don't need the library. It means that to have both of them gives us an even stronger future support for not only the access we need to heritage and the diversity. Am I kind of coming along behind you?
Yep,
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that answer.
Yep. Thank you.
Jennifer, we are coming up on time, but I think there's one question in the Q&A that I'll just flag. Well, there's two comments. One was noting the question of environment as a determining factor in the way we understand the process trust, and some praise also for the shared model. But to come back to Thurston's question, which I'm going to try and summarize it briefly, but just to say, is there a space to maybe combine crowdsourcing with the kind of the well-curated or authoritative data models that you've described here? Is there a way of doing a hybrid model that would bring those both together to maybe provide some support for less funded or less structurally supported voices?
Yep. Yeah. Yes and no. Let me go back to the usability one. So my opinion is that it's this first point in the usability, which is where we need the crowdsourcing. So we need as global, as consistent and coherent, complete understanding of the use cases in order to do all the rest of these. So this is not just a set, it's an ordered list. You start with scoping your design through those shared use cases. So in terms, though, of building ontologies and vocabularies, if everyone did it, then we wouldn't have any standards. There's a lot of expertise, not necessarily needed, but useful in terms of just practical experience as well as theoretical understanding of what works and what doesn't. Having folks engaged with the modeling side makes it consistent and coherent, which is important for usability. Whereas a completely crowdsourced, open-ended, let's just make whatever relationships and classes are currently useful to me is not likely to cohere into something that you would easily use in other environments. Or essentially, it would be very hard to turn it into a standard. So I agree about the agility, and indeed all of the evolution of standards needs to co-evolve with the data in order to stay current and useful. The APIs and profiles need to keep up with the use cases and the technologies. So it's this constant ebb and flow within the ecosystem of a change here ripples to a change there, ripples back to a change in the data. And I think the question is mostly, which butterflies need to flap their wings in order to get the most beneficial changes for everyone involved, rather than which bulls need to run around in the china shop and break things and pick up the pieces and make something good for that one person or that one institution.
Fantastic. Thanks. Thank you so much. We have run out of time, but I think this has just been an extraordinary starting point for what will surely be an ongoing series of discussions. Angus, did you want to say something?
I suspect this discussion could go on for a very long time, actually, and many questions came to me as well. And Robert, so thank you so much for so detailed a mapping of an ecosystem, which I think will be the object of discussion amongst us all for quite some time. The lecture was recorded, as I mentioned, so it is available for anybody to come back to, and I think I will be coming back to it. But just to say, once again, thank you so much for being the opening speaker in our lecture series, and thank you again for the clarity of your presentation. Just to say to all of you, for those of you who are interested, in 2 weeks' time on the 8th of June, our second speaker will be Elaine Traharn from Stanford University, discussing uncertainty in manuscript technologies and the potential of computational tools. And you can find the sign up in the same place again, but we will be advertising the lectures widely again. And then just to bring it to a close, just once again to say thank you very much, Rob, for a truly excellent lecture. And I'm not sure that that this format allows for public clapping of any type, but I'm sure there is this widespread applause. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to Elaine and the third presentation, who I'm sure will be even more on topic than
that's Caroline Bassett from Cambridge on the Trust Authority and the automation of expertise in 4 weeks' time. Thank you all very much.